All right, welcome to the Wyld Farm Family Show, episode 18. On this show, we do everything involving farm, food, family, and fun. So we have an opportunity to bring on amazing guests from all walks of life, dig into their origin stories, hear their value, and then have a little fun in the kitchen with Chef Nick. And if you've caught any of the little short snippet videos, you'll see that Nick's got some really interesting tips on how to cut different veggies and herbs and everything. And if you didn't catch the video on social media recently and the one with the chandeliers, I mean, that one is a true takeaway. I can't tell you how many times that I cut a bell pepper with the kids in the kitchen and there are seeds all over the place. So truly a lifesaver. So we will get to the segment at the end with that too, but we also have an awesome guest with decades of experience in agriculture. And so I think that you're going to get a lot of value out of this. And if you're curious about where agriculture was and where it's going, this is the guy that knows most of that stuff. And he's got a really great show that he leads himself with a lot of great agricultural expertise, enthusiasts, and stuff out there in the world. But Nick, what's going on here?
Good evening, Troy. Happy Thankful Thursday. And it's so great to be back for episode number 18. We have a wonderful, amazing guest, like you said, for tonight. We're going to jump into little Father's Cooking Corner this evening. So we're going to whip up some fun things inspired by our guest tonight. But Troy, how are you? And weather is improving, obviously, in Michigan. So what are some of the fun activities that you and your kids have been up to lately?
Yeah. And what's funny is like weather improving. I know coming from you in Minnesota, me in Michigan, weather improving means that it's now in like the 60s, right? So we're just enjoying the fact that the sun's actually out and we don't have our coats and our gloves on. But yeah, I mean, our kids, we force our kids outside as much as possible. And so in the summertime, that's almost all day. And then me being a big dad, I'm always out there doing something. But basketball has been the hot topic. So I've been trying to push basketball for the kids because that was my favorite growing up. But neither one, not to say they didn't have an interest, like they did play in a few leagues that I had the opportunity to coach, but they're now like picking up balls and playing in the driveway and asking me how to do layups. And so, Dad here, man, I'm out there, I'm holding Keaton in one arm and I'm like, this is how you go through the mechanics. And so I'm loving every minute of it. Even if I have one baby in arm, it's great time, man.
Well, hey, you could have a very good advantage in the game of horse because you got to actually hold the kid while you make the shot, right? So,
yep. You got to get your technique in. That's right.
Yes. All right. Well, let's bring up Rodger, our amazing guest for this evening. Good evening, Rodger. Happy Thankful Thursday. And thank you so much for joining Troy and myself on the Wyld Family Farm and Fun Show. How are you? Where are you calling from, Rodger? And one more thing, what's a fun fact?
Oh, wow. Well, I'm calling from Sacramento, and we live in Sacramento, California. And I don't know how fun the fact is, but I grew up on a farm in Illinois and have lived in Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Ohio, Colorado, and California. And maybe one fact is I think I've been on farms in 48 states, a few places in Canada and Puerto Rico and some foreign countries too. So I've been in a lot of places and I've seen farming done in a lot of different ways and enjoyed the people and the food everywhere.
Wow. Amazing. And if you don't, what are the two states that you don't have that, what are the two states that you still have to see?
Well, Alaska, although technically I changed planes there once, so I'm not so sure. I shouldn't kind of claim Alaska, but I've never been to Mississippi. I've been all around it. and I've never been to Mississippi. I've talked to a lot of people from Mississippi, and there's a lot going on in agriculture there.
Yeah.
But I just need to. It looks like I could rent a car. Like sometime I'm going to New Orleans and just go up there and drive down the road and find somebody. And
Yeah.
So anyway, that's what I'm going to have to do to check it off the list, is get to Mississippi sometime.
So I would love to connect you. Nick and I actually.
Yes, we know a good Blackberry farmer down there. You could go.
So one of the best, or at least most experienced from what we understand, Blackberry farmers is in Mississippi. And he was sharing like incredible research information where he was managing the pest control on his farm through hummingbirds and everything. And so just anything that you could ever think of blackberries, varieties, how to grow them, pest control, like it was phenomenal. Like I swear I learned a ton.
Did you say blackberries?
Yes.
You know that for some reason the blackberries, I'm really get intrigued by the blackberry farming, because you remember back when they had all the lawsuits against tobacco companies, and the part of the tobacco settlements, there was millions of dollars. And in Ohio, they decided that they could take that money and help the farmers convert from growing tobacco to growing blackberries. And then also part of the funding is that they ended up saying, well, to create demand for blackberries, we got to figure out what's good about it. So they went to Ohio State to the research there, and they determined that blackberries were protective on esophageal cancer. And that if you could take like a blackberry and put it on a white paper napkin, the stain that's left on that napkin is left in your throat when you swallow. So anyway, just this roundabout story of getting farmers converted from growing tobacco to growing to blackberries, to figuring out where blackberries would fit in a really healthy diet, but even protecting cancer.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So Robert on our show talked about that. He talked about cancer properties. He also brought up something interesting, and I know he's going to connect with Nick still on this, which is powdered blackberries, and how he was going to sell powdered blackberries for one part of his revenue stream.
Yeah. Interesting things.
So you kind of alluded to it a little bit, and we mentioned it in the beginning, which is the decades of experience in farming. And so walk us through that journey. And so how did you get started in farming, growing up on a farm in Illinois to going to all these farms across the country? And what kind of keeps you in this space? Like, tell us why you love it so much.
Yeah, you know what? I'm kind of in the process of trying to go back 1,000 years if I can. And I think that my family originally were livestock people in Scotland that were moved to Northern Ireland to be part of the plantation of Ireland. And the British moved them all over there. And then somewhere in the 1840s, one of them came to the United States and made their way to Illinois, and were able to get a small farm just outside of Peoria back in the 1840s, when you could get 80 acres because of the land grant from the War of 1812. And then you could go claim the land, and you could start farming back there. And that's how they started farming. And what they always had, and everybody around there had, was that you had livestock. So you certainly had cattle, and they had hogs. And so from the middle 1800s on forward, you always did. And the only reason you had grain, nobody liked grain. They had grain because they fed their livestock. And so anything they grew walked off the farm. And every quarter mile that you could go in any direction, that was the same. I mean, it just looked like big white houses and big red barns, and sometimes picket fences. And everybody had hogs and cattle. They started getting rid of the chickens. People to have some big gardens, but aside from that, it was hogs and cattle, and the product for everybody was pork and beef. And I grew up in that situation. And but then when I went to college at Illinois State, I didn't really think I wanted to stay and do that. I really felt like I was kind of ready to get away from the farm and go somewhere else and see something else. But when I went to college at Illinois State, I majored in radio and television and sociology and psychology. And when I got out, I got married while I was there. And when I got out, I got a job at the local radio station because my wife had another year to finish school. And at the radio station, I was selling ads and creating commercials. And the farm director left and they said, "Do you want to take this over?" And I said, "Sure." So I had an hour show at noon every day in Normal, Illinois, which is Bloomington, Normal, Illinois, where Illinois State University is. And I had a noon show, and I also had one at 6 in the morning every day. And I would start interviewing farmers, and then you'd get things from USDA and others. And I had to go out and do sales and do commercials too. And I just came to the conclusion that I like that better than anything. I had the people on the radio station was telling me that, you know what, you could make a career in this, and we could get you into broadcasting, and someday you might be able to manage radio stations and other things. On the other hand, I just thought, well, wait a minute, I like speaking for farmers, because even though I'm not going to go back and be a farmer, I really like people that live on farms and care about farms, and I want to help them tell the story. And so I've kind of made a point right then that I was in a fork in the road, and saying, well, you could stay in this and you could stay in broadcasting, or what are the ways that you could help farmers? Well, while I was there, I helped the county, McLean County cattlemen, the sheep producers, the dairy farmers, and whom am I leaving out? Pork producers, all have booths at the county fairs, and my wife and I pass out samples of meat. And I contacted all of the commodity organizations. At the time, it was the National Livestock and Meat Board, the National Pork Producers Council, the American Sheep Producers Council, and I asked them all for help. And they would send me promotion materials, and then the farmers and the farmers' wives and kids, and would all come and help us. We go to supermarkets and fairs and pass out samples of pork products and tell the stories of how everything was grown. And I thought, I love this. This is great. You know, gee, wouldn't it be good if you could do this for a living? Then if you could just like help farmers. And you know, at the time especially, you know, during the day I'd be calling on other businesses, and they were fine. You could go knock on the door of the furniture store man and convince him why he should be advertising on the radio station. But it was much more fun to work with the farmers, because they always like fed you. You know, you could jump in the car and go in the barnyard, and they say, well, you're close to dinner. Come on, we'll put another plate on.
Yes.
And I like that attitude.
Yes.
That just the salt of the earth people. And even back home where I grew up too, there was a community club, and all the farm families all got together once a month, and they could rent the junior high gym, and all us kids could run and get sweaty and play basketball while everybody's sitting around talking after they had, a potluck supper. And anyway, I just didn't want to leave that. So I started writing letters, and I sent applications all over the country to farm organizations. I sent 600 letters out, and I ended up getting invited to Denver to be the assistant director of the Sheep Industry Development Program. Even though I didn't take an agriculture course, I was hired to be the assistant director of the Sheep Industry Development Program. So my wife and I moved to Denver. Now, I should pause and take a breath and let you guys ask a question, or tell me to slow down at that stage.
No, keep going. I'm actually learning a lot from the history aspect here of it, and most importantly, how you fell in love with it. So keep going.
Well, and then I started in that job. The first thing they told me to do, I'm 22 years old or 23 years old or something like that. And the first thing they said is, we want you to organize these regional sheep for profit centers, and we'll put an all-star team together of specialists. We'll take like a nutritionist, an economist, all these different people in each region of the country, and bring them together. And so what my job was to go to every land-grant university, meet with somebody that had some specialty to help with sheep production, get them to come together, and then write a paper and present a symposium in each region. And then from those symposia, we came up with handbooks that for people that wanted to raise sheep, and it fit for each area of the country. And one of the things I was really proud of that we did then is that's missing so often today is that we created budgets. So, it's easy to say, well, you ought to raise sheep. But when you start plugging that in and saying, well, how much does it cost and how much can I make, and more of a business plan? And we did those too. And I thought that I felt really good about it. The extension service people who I'd grown up with, county extension, but the federal and state extension I worked with, they were wonderful people too. And I started going back to the Department of Agriculture and meeting good people back there. And again, I just loved them. They were just great people that wanted to help. And they gave me the excuse when I mentioned to you guys another time that I have been to almost every one of these states. And it was in part, getting started like this, that I'd get out and work with the land grants. And then they would take me out and I go visit the ranchers and the farmers and often break bread with them, and which has always been an important thing. And but I'd only been there for a little over a year, and I decided that I could not stand the person that was running the organization. I felt like that they weren't really respectful of farmers, and I was the farm kid in the organization, and I felt like they were talking down to farmers, and really, it just didn't seem right. So I decided, well, honesty is always the best policy. So I thought, well, I'll just walk into the CEO and tell him. Well, it didn't go so well. I guess I was kind of naive. I thought, well, honesty is always best, but except when you're telling your boss he's a jerk, I guess. And so I walked away from that, and I didn't know right away what was going to happen. But one of the sheep producers that was on my board that was running this program, he came to me one night after I'd put a banquet together for them, for the lamb feeders at the Brown Palace Hotel in Denver. And they said, we want you to organize a speaker. I brought Orion Samuelson from WGN in to be a speaker. And they had the sheep herders breakfast. And I thought, how do I do a sheep herders breakfast? And you won't guess what it is. I mean, certainly you could guess that it's going to be like eggs, but they're also going to have lamb chops, which were true, 7:00 in the morning. But the thing that really distinguished it was that instead of orange juice, we had rosé wine. Mm-hmm. And so in the Brown Palace Hotel, while people eating lamb chops and omelets at 7 a.m. in Denver, Colorado, all the wait staff kept going around filling everybody's glasses with chilled rosé wine. It's an interesting way to start the day. And then as the day progressed, and we were like in the hospitality room that, I don't know, American Cyanamid or somebody was hosting, hospitality. One of my board members said, "Hey, I got to tell you something." I said, "What's that?" And he said, "We're going to get your boss fired." And I said, "Oh, how about that?" And they said, "But that's the good news. You know what the bad news is?" And I said, "Sure. What's the bad news?" And he said, "It's going to take a while, and he's going to fire you first." And great. And then he said, "However, we're putting an organization together in Indianapolis, the Indiana Beef Cattle Association. We've merged the Indiana Livestock Feeders and the Indiana Cattlemen, and we're going to have a checkoff. It's going to be checkoff and a membership, and we're putting these two groups together. Come back and interview for the job." And so sure. So I went back to Indianapolis, and they interviewed the whole board, and they offered me the job. And I said, well, I can't do that. I said, it's you're offering me a job that's, less than what I'm making now, and it's going to be hard for me to make less. And they said, okay, well, what do you need? And I told them, and then and they said, okay. So they hired me, and then I got in and I started looking at the books, and I said, you don't have enough money to pay me. And my president just laughed, and he said, I know, but you said that's what you wanted. And he said, you're just going to have to go raise enough money to pay yourself. and so I started going out to all the sale barns to try to get them to do a voluntary checkoff of $0.25 per head. And and eventually they did, and part of the money they used to pay me too. But I'd go to places around the state where they were always really friendly. I always loved the people, but go from southern Indiana, it's very much south, to northern Indiana, closer to you guys, it's very much north. And I learned that, oftentimes, they're just a different style of communicating. And so I'd have to go north of Indianapolis and use kind of one style of communicating, and south than the other. I found that in the north, they could accept me pretty quick. But the south, it took a long time. But once they supported you, boy, they never changed. I mean, they were really, really good. And in the south, I was down in one county that's so rural. I went up to one of these farmers and I said, well, you need to come up to Indianapolis this guy was probably in his late 50s. And I said, you need to come up to Indianapolis for a cattlemen's meeting. And he said, well, I don't think so. And I said, how come? And he said, I've never been there. I said, you've never been to Indianapolis? And he said, I've never been out of the county. And the guy was nearly 60. And I said, how come you never left the county? And he said, no need to. Well, okay. I mean, how you argue with that? It's kind of like he had a cow herd and he drove a school bus, and he was able to get half a century and never have to leave the county. But he still joined, and he still got it. And then on the other hand, I went up to the northern part of the state and I got the Amish sale barn. And I was pulling in and it's just full of all the horses and buggies for all the Amish that were coming in for the sale. And somebody said, well, you're probably not going to get the Amish community to do a voluntary checkoff to do advertising and promotion. But they did. I found that there's one person you had to talk to, and then they had a meeting, and they became one of our supporters that they do checkoff too. And so we did a lot of things with a little bit of money and getting it started. You needed to tell people what you planned on doing, but it's hard when you didn't have the money at first to have anything to show. So I went to Elanco, part of Eli Lilly, and pitched to them that would they help us put something together, and they did. And we created something called Hoosier Beef Days. And with their help, we had a promotion in downtown Indianapolis there at the Circle, and we had steers on a halter right in the center of town, out in the sidewalks, and had a speaker and some keynotes. And we, at the time, David Letterman had a radio show in Indianapolis, and we took a cattle farmer to the David Letterman show.
Yes.
And, that's before he made the big time. And it was great and had nothing but, good experiences. We did a lot of things. We helped get the national checkoff going with beef. We ended up producing more presidents from Indiana than anybody in the rest of the eastern part of the United States combined. Our people, we got very, very active in the national associations, both at the Meat Board and at the Cattlemen's Association.
Yeah.
And I was happy with that. But then I I got a call from a headhunter who said, we have an opening to be the CEO of the National Pork Producers Council in Des Moines. Could we talk to you about it? And I said, well, sure. And so I went to interview for the job, and I was one of the 4 finalists for the National Pork Producers job. And the person they chose, Orville Sweet, who, as soon as I saw he was in it, I said, well, Orville, they need to hire you. I mean, you really can do this better than I could do it. I mean, they did. And but then Orville in turn offered the job to everybody else that was in the final run. There were 3 others that didn't get his job. He offered everybody a job, and I said, sure. And so we moved to Des Moines, which at the time, my wife wasn't a fan because even when we left Denver, she loved Denver, and we left Denver for Indianapolis. And I said, when we were driving out to Indianapolis, I said, there must be something good about in this move that you see us moving to Indianapolis. And the only thing she could think of that she said was, well, at least it's not Des Moines. And sure enough, we moved to Des Moines. And it was good. I mean, we liked Iowa too. We enjoyed work the National Pork Producers Council. I was in charge of all the communications and promotions and bringing some of the new team in, and started the program that led to the other white meat that was repositioning, and I got really enthused, and I was brand new in the job. Still, I was maybe 30 or 28, 29 or 30, but there were people that were taking shots at pork production and livestock on a New York radio station, and they were trying to find somebody to appear to counter the guy that was actually, he'd written a book about cholesterol and fat and the American diet, critical of livestock production. They couldn't get anybody to do it. They went to the American Meat Institute, they went to the Meat Board, they went to the Cattlemen's Association. Everybody was afraid of going to into New York and appearing on this call-in show. And I said, well, I'll do it. So I flew to New York and had a call-in show, and it went really, really well, surprisingly. And also we were able to raise enough money with the pork producers that we got Paul Harvey to do commercials, and he invited me to come to his studio. So I actually went in when Paul Harvey was doing his show, because he did a spot for pork producers, and I went out and I met him. And the funny thing is that when you go with Paul Harvey, he said, well, come on into the studio with me. And he just wrote on all his stories, he just wrote like 2 or 3 sentences, and then he just winged it. He just made up stuff. He just say all sorts of things, and he had nothing written down. And I was just sitting there watching him, and I'm just like shaking my head, and I think, I can't believe this guy. He's incredible, and he had a great audience too. Yeah. But then, another kind of headhunter search firm contacted me and said we have an opening to be the CEO of the American Sheep Producers Council, and that was in Denver. And would I come and talk to them? And so I did. So I went out and talked to them, and our son had just been born, and I left the hospital to fly to Denver, which wasn't popular at the time. But then I got to Denver, and they hired me. And so I moved back to Denver, which was an interesting one, because I had some people working for me then. I come back, I've been the lowest on the totem pole. And then I came back and I had some people that had been mean to me when I went there, and they now were working for me. So that's kind of fun.
That's how that works.
These things come around. And so in the sheep producers, we had the American Wool Council, American Lamb Council, and I had merchandisers around the country, and had an office in New York with wool. and really did some good things. And but there was another organization. It was called the National Wool Growers, and it was based in Salt Lake City, Utah. And I looked at him and thought, you know what? This industry is too small. It's not getting bigger. We really need to try to merge these organizations. The sheep producers was a checkoff. The wool growers was working with government affairs, so we flew over to Salt Lake with my president and said, why don't we merge these organizations? And it was, I don't know, it got people really riled up right away and thinking that we were trying to take over. And I immediately wrote a letter of resignation saying, here, just use this if you want it. I mean, if I get in the way, and I talked the other executive into it as well. And we said, we'll just resign, go ahead and put these together. And if you're worried about having the CEO, get a new one. I don't care, but this is right for the industry. But the first hurdle we had to do was USDA. And we flew in, took some people with us into the USDA, and the Secretary of Agriculture brought in all these lawyers and others and said, well, all the lawyers are saying, Mr. Secretary, you can't let them do that because they have a checkoff program and they're government and they want to do government affairs. And we just made the point to the secretary that, well, why not? I mean, we know how we can do this. We got some membership dues too. And we brought in a rancher from California. His name was Bob Blackford, who knew the secretary. And, and he was a good friend too. And we sat around, and it was the secretary at the time was Richard Ling. And when the lawyers were saying, Mr. Secretary, they can't do that. We can't let them do that. The secretary just said, you know what? I've decided they're going to get to do it. And all the lawyers started saying, but Mr. Secretary. And he said, that cow's through the chute. and so they let us merge. And after we got everything all put together, actually, it just seemed like they still needed a fresh face. And they made me the CEO of the new association. I did it for a couple of years, and then I resigned and started doing consulting, and immediately hooked up with the Sterling Rice Group in Boulder, Colorado. And we ended up having a lot of great agriculture clients that we were coming up with promotional programs for agriculture. And one of the ones that I was working on, I had a client, was the National Beef Council as a client, and I was helping them with a number of projects, but one of them that they needed somebody to have marketing and promotion experience. And so I said, I think that you need to get somebody that's worked in California commodities and shake it up a little bit. So I called the marketing director from the Blue Diamond Almonds because I really was impressed with what they were doing. And I tried to talk her into being available to move to Denver. And instead, she got the almond people to get their headhunter to convince me to move to California. And the whole thing started. I was trying to get someone from California to come to Colorado. And they ended up convincing me to move to California. And when I got out there, our board wasn't speaking to each other. They'd even had a fist fight in one of the board meetings. There was so much hostility between what they call the independents out here and the co-op that it was pretty extreme. And we had people suing us. We had people that sued that it was unconstitutional to have our program. And the case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, which we eventually won, but it was incredible to be able to get there. But in the meantime, we developed, what part of my recommendation was that we needed to do a promotion program that focused on the nutritional benefits of almonds. And at that time, everybody was saying, don't eat almonds, they're terrible for you. In fact, we surveyed cardiologists, and they all thought that almonds were high in cholesterol, which just tells you they don't even take nutrition courses to become doctors because there's no cholesterol in plant food.
Yes, we
And
know
yet
that's true.
most doctors were saying that there was. So
Yeah.
we started with a small budget, started working on nutrition research. And then from that, we built a promotion program. And from that, they kept expanding. When I came to the almonds, total production was 300 million pounds. And 10 years later, we were over 1 billion. And the demand has just grown like crazy. I also worked in international programs, and I took on China because at first we weren't allowed to do any international because it was with some of our members were getting the FAS contracts. But they said, okay, we'll let you do China because we don't think there's much there. There's not much hope for China becoming a market. And so I started working in China and had people in there, and I'd go over like 3 times a year to China. And we ended up it became the top market in the country, in the world. Yeah. Out of all, 75% of all the almonds are exported, and China went to the top of the list. Wow. And so it was great, all good experiences, and lots and lots of positives. And then, I mean, that it's kind of, after I'd done that for 10 years, I just felt like nobody should be anywhere 10 years. And so I quit and started doing consulting, but then I got recruited to be the CEO of the strawberry industry. So I worked there for a couple of years, and then just said, I'm living at the coast. We have a house that we can look out the window and see the Pacific Ocean and walk down the hill to the beach and still work with farmers. And I thought, this isn't bad. I think I just stay here. And so we just started doing consulting. And then a few years later, like I said, I decided to kind of get back to helping conversations with farmers and working for farmers, and decided to start doing the podcast. And so that pretty much is it. There's probably a longer version, but that's plenty long to have covered a few years for you.
Yeah, well, incredible. First of all, too, I would guess for many of our listeners, including myself even, is that we don't see the behind the scenes of agriculture, right? Where all those associations are working on contracts and legalities and production lines and distribution and all that. And you were right in the thick of all of that for many different industries, to the point where you were being headhunted for it because of that. And we don't think of, when we talk about traceability, and our organization tries to explain know where your food comes from, but sometimes the extent of that is finding your closest farmer and maybe going out and visiting the farm and learning how they grow. But there's so much more to that on how the systems work. And you kind of alluded to it there, which is behind the scenes. There's organizations that are kind of butting heads and trying to work together and all kinds of stuff.
Well, in fact, the one project I did was for the beef industry, and we took some ranchers and some other specialists, and we went to really virtually all the leading fast food chains. We went to McDonald's headquarters. They actually had me participate in Hamburger University. Went down to Miami, met with Burger King, went to the Hardee's headquarters, and we sat down and we would put together a team, include ranchers and including some food scientists and others, to identify what are we going to do if there is a health issue, a safety issue, and how do we have a quick response for the entire industry to do the right thing. And then we'd work with the other associations. We'd work with the Packers Association and the others. And so there's a lot of that to do, and a lot to do with USDA, and also working really close with Extension and land grant universities across the country.
And so all the ones you mentioned, I'm curious because Michigan is heavily dairy farming. Was there any part of that journey that was dairy farming for you?
No, not really. I not worked directly with dairy. It's always been a little tricky because I felt like uh, so much of the beef is dairy origin. The calves and but they were never very involved. I mean, they had their own checkoff programs for dairy, and so it was always on the milk side rather than their beef side. And it's so I haven't worked for them directly. Although I'll be bragging now to admit at this time that I also got recruited for the CEO job of the dairy industry at one stage. And
Not surprised.
I think I managed to. This is one of those cases where I managed to make some non politically correct statements too that didn't go anywhere.
Yeah.
But I've always felt like in these groups, though, I always felt like my role was to represent the farmers. So I would be the CEO, and I just felt like we have to always remember who we're working for and respect them. I think there's
Yes.
what I don't like in associations is that you can throw a good party and do a good slideshow and now it's a PowerPoint. Um, and not necessarily take on the really tough questions.
Yeah.
And I think that I've gotten on Clubhouse now, and so I'm listening to some conversations and participating. So Clubhouse, I really like it because it's this audio chat line, and that you can be on with people at restaurants and farmers from all over the world and talk, and they can be recognized to make some comments and hear comments. And I'm sorry to hear a number of them expressing really frustrations with their councils and boards. I'm sure there's some that are very happy with them, but there's quite a few that they're either right or there's some poor communications taking place. And anyway, I just think that the job of these programs can do a lot to have impact for farmers, but they can also waste money too. Not everything they do is going to be right, and there has to be some respect for farmers. What typically happens in these national organizations is the people that are frustrated saying, we need to change our director, let's send somebody in there to shake him up. And then when they go in there and they find out that it's not as bad as they thought, then the term back in the state is, well, he got nationalized. They think they got, that they got sold a bill of goods. Well, it may or may not be true, but but they can have a great impact. And when I look back at the groups that I've just mentioned to you, I'm proud of what happened when I was there, and it happened I don't think it happened because of me, but it was teaming with the leadership, the farmers and the ranchers, that we were able to have impact and make a difference, and really kind of cut through the BS and do things that would say, okay, well, this is going to raise the demand, or this is going to solve that problem, or this is going to make the program more efficient. And I think that if you went back and asked those cattlemen in Indiana, I think that certainly the early years of the pork producers when I was there, how they felt about it at that time, I think pretty good. And I think the sheep industry, pretty good. Almonds definitely feel like they've progressed, and the money spent by their organization has helped them be more profitable than they would have been without it.
Yeah, no, it's cool to think you had a hand in all those decisions back then, right? And driving all that efficiency. You have a question?
Yeah, I do have a question for you, Rodger. And wow, I'm just blown away by your decades of experience. And I love what you said about like that you always, it was like you always wanted to work for the farmer in all of these different positions. And so as you look ahead, like if there's assumptions or predictions, like what is it, the one issue or topic that, and I know it's probably going to change from different farming industry to different farming industry, but I think I'm trying to get a question across as like bringing awareness to the consumer, like myself, like Troy, like what is the number one issue or topic that you think or you believe needs advocacy for farmers? Like
Yeah, it's so
looking
hard
ahead into the future.
you think when I talk about this all the time, it'd be easier and easier to get that into a soundbite, but it's not easy. I think that you just have to keep telling the story about how the food is produced. I think that there's a couple of things that are that I get excited about. One is farmers getting started and new farmers getting into the business, and some of that frontier are smaller scale. It's
Yeah.
people that it's not what having several thousand acres and several $1 million in equipment, because people can't just get started that way anymore.
Mhm.
So I like the looking at food hubs and looking at farmers that are figuring out a way, people that are figuring out a way to be on a farm, and I get enthusiastic about that. And for example, there's a lot of people that have jobs in the city wish they wouldn't. I mean, wish that they could be in the country, wish they could raise their kids in the country, wish they could work outside. And it used to be that, unless they were born and inherited a farm, there's just like no way in. I mean, because how much is farmland costing? I mean, you can't get loans for that amount of money anymore. And how much are tractors? And people can spend $1 million on a combine alone anymore. I've talked to people that have the scale of hog operations that are existing these days. And one guy that I know pretty well was trying to bring a grandson into the business, and to add a family member, they had a capital outlay. It was going to be nearly $1 million. I can't even get my head around this yet, but nearly $1 million in operating loan to be able to get the scale up to support another family. And boy, that's really, really challenging. I think those large scale operations can be done very well. I know that some really good ones, and I think, that's more power to them. But it's kind of more exciting to see people be able to find middle ground. I mean, to find people that are back in the middle of the continent that can look beyond corn and soybeans. Nothing wrong with corn and soybeans, but there's a whole lot of other things that can be grown there. And I've talked to some people in your neck of the woods that are coming up with some new exotic grains and some interesting grains, and then direct marketing. So I get excited about those because there's more chances for people to get into business and more people to do direct marketing and more opportunities to really cut out some of the middlemen that they don't necessarily have to have. The only way in is to be large scale commodity that goes to some central center, the processing, and then back through a national distribution center to chains.
Yeah.
I'm not against those. I mean, I really feel like it's an important part of the process. But if you're looking at a kind of hub and spoke of a food system, today more than ever, there's an opportunity for people to have, hoop houses, the greenhouses, grow inside rooftops in the middle of Detroit and all over the thing. And I find that really, really exciting. And some of the same practices I see taking place in the communities are creating even community gardens that are pretty large scale.
Yes.
And I see some areas that people that have been incarcerated and have a hard time finding out how to get back into work again, that are getting trained in some of these community gardens, and then learning how they may be able to have a relationship with a restaurant or get a food truck or have the CSAs. So I find that very, very interesting. It's really hard to go to a whiteboard and draw that map that has hubs. It's not going to replace the food system we have right now, but it gets a lot more people in. And why they get in, I think that a reality is today that many can't expect that enterprise is going to support their family by itself. Oftentimes, if it's a couple, one of them needs to keep a job in town, and to keep insurance and other things, and put together several enterprises. I mean, I think the day of having a single source of income for a family that produces what you need to, save a little, send the kids to college, take a vacation once in a while, and, paint the house, that's the reality. But I see people chipping away on that.
Yeah.
It's a new version of American dream.
Yep.
And I find that inspiring and something to get excited about when you see that taking place.
Yeah. What I've come to realize in the work that I do is that people are looking at farming as a way to teach principles, like teach principles to their kids, to teach principles to themselves. Because, and like, so in the conversations I've had, it's there's so many distractions out there in today's world. There's so much trust factors in the food that you eat. Is it processed? Where does it come from? And lots of questions. And so people are starting to go back to the roots. They're starting to go back to nature itself and try to build a life that feels a little bit more intimate for their family, if not themselves or their couple. And so I totally agree with that. I mean, we've seen a boom in homesteads. Like homesteading and farmsteading is a huge boom. Like there are couples out there across the world that are just, drop everything and start a farm and grow food for yourselves for enough to live on. And, maybe you have a side job or something. But I think the concept is like living with nature and building those principled values that maybe you're not getting out in the world today through distractions.
Well, I also want to add something for the other side of the coin a little bit. And that is, there's a lot of people that didn't grow up on a farm, don't have a chance to go back to a farm, go to work for a larger farming company and can have a great career too. I'm running into people that their parents came to this country to work in the fields, and maybe were undocumented, and then they're able to grow up and go get an ag degree at Fresno State or Cal Poly or somewhere like that, and then get hired and have really good, well-paying jobs and working with larger companies. I know that they're being trained and they're conscientious to do the right thing and take the right safety standards and not cut corners, and be able to make enough that they can get a house in Santa Maria or somewhere else, and send their kids to get their kids to go to college because they're in another part of agriculture. And I respect them just as much as I do the farm laborers themselves. But it's another, I think, part of the story is to just see that there are people that can get into it and do something that they can be proud of. Mm-hmm. I feel like the thing that we all struggle with in cross agriculture, in particular up to now, is just trust. I think that it's not something that's only agriculture. It's something that really applies to all kinds of large corporations, and I think rightly so, because there's when you get to be a really, really large corporation, it's hard to keep track of everything.
Yep.
Farmers don't have silos anymore, but corporations do. And so they have silos that don't communicate with each other. So they can put pressures in these really, really large organizations, sometimes multinational organizations, that kind of to the effect to say, hey, listen, I don't want to hear the particulars on this, but you better get this job done, or you're going to be out on the street. And I think that consumers are right to suspect that sometimes some organizations will tend to cut corners and not be on every detail. And I think that's where the risk is with really, really large systems, is that they can be very fragile. I mean, if you or I screw up, we may have a small enterprise, and so it only has a small effect. But if you're a really big company and you do something wrong, and all of a sudden you've got salmonella or E. coli in the stores because somebody just was cutting corners or not being managed very properly. And so I don't think it's wrong for consumers to be a little suspicious, that they want to know the companies that they're doing business with. But on the other hand, back to this job of talking for farmers, every case I can think of when a consumer is able to ask any farmer face to face about what they do, they come away with a good idea. I mean, feeling good about it. I hear stories all the time of somebody that says, well, I'm not organic and this is the reason I'm not. And some consumer would come to them and say, well, how come, I'm just buying organic? And he said, well, let me explain what I do. And it had to do with like using copper or something that's okay in the organic program. He says, but I'm against it. And this is an approach I'm taking. Every single case, they say, okay, all I needed you to do is look me in the eye and give me a good reason and give me assurance of what you're doing and why you're doing it and how I can feel good about it.
Yes. Yeah. And I wish there was more of that, because there are sometimes when we see at farmers markets where the farmer can't make it and they send a farmhand, and now you're relying on the farmhand to be able to communicate that to the customer, right? And then you're relying on the customer to ask the right questions. So there's probably an educational gap there on both sides, which is how could we get people to be more curious when they approach a farmer, and how could we train potentially our farmhands to be able to communicate that experience?
Yeah. A lot to do.
Yeah.
Well, you do a great job. It's it gives. I get optimistic though. The more I get out and talk to the farmers, you feel a lot better about it.
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of issues, but I think they're all things we can address. And I think that, being honest and getting more people involved. And I think that, again, I get back to the point of helping people find a way that they can have a career in agriculture, and that they don't have to themselves be large scale, but they may work for a large company. But you can go to work for a large company and be one of those difference makers that's going to make sure you're conscientious and you're leading it the right way.
Yeah.
One of the first elected chairman I had with the Almond Board actually got his PhD at MIT, but decided that it was in oceanography or something like that, but decided what he really wanted to do was get on a farm. And he went to a farm in California, and they said, well, we don't have anything for a PhD. And he said, I'll do anything. And they said, well, you can go hook up irrigation pipes and work around in the field. And it was the lowest job that they had in the place. And he did that. And he ended up working his way all the way to the top and became the CEO. There's all kinds of stories like that too, of people that decide, what, I want to be connected to food and farming, and I'm just going to do what it takes, and it's going to be good for me and good for my family. Let's make it happen. I mean,
Rodger, that's kind of what you did too. Remember, they wanted to offer you money that they didn't have, and you had to create it.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, that just kind of turned into being asked to be a CEO for many organizations. So
yeah,
if there's a good example in there, it's your story.
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know you alluded to it a little bit for our listeners, and we always chat in the links. So we'll make sure that we do that, not just for anybody that watches this, but for the podcast. But tell us a little bit, just a tiny bit about Farm to Table Talk and how they can reach that, and like what it looks like for who you interview and things like that.
Sure. Well, I have a podcast that's I put up every weekend called Farm to Table Talk. They're usually like a half an hour to 45 minutes long. And you've been on before, and I get people, try to get people like you that are just interesting, have good stories, and we cover a pretty wide range, as you know, Troy, that everything from people about trends that are happening in restaurants to community gardens to small farms to large scale farming operations, and a lot of different dimensions. Trying to make it interesting, try to make it seem like we're sitting down and having a cup of coffee. And I would imagine that the listeners there too, and what might they want to hear. And I kind of make sure that I'm not too careful about, I can ask dumb questions. I don't care if it sounds dumb. And oftentimes I have people say that, well, I'm glad you said that because I was thinking the same thing, but I'm afraid if I'd speak up, it seemed like I was dumb. And I think, oh, it's all right. It doesn't matter.
Hey, a question not asked never gets answered. So
yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Rodger. It's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed our conversation on your podcast, and I couldn't wait to bring you on for this one. So thank you for taking us through that story. We're grateful to have you on. We'd love for you to stick around if you have the time for Nick to prepare something in the kitchen here.
Great. Well, thank you for having me, and I hope a few people tune in and catch us wherever they get podcasts sometime on Farm to Table Talk.
Excellent. All right, Nick, you're up, man. Let's see what you've whipped up in the kitchen today.
Well, thank you so much again, Rodger, and I'm just so impressed with your insight and how well spoken you are about all different walks of life as it comes to farms. And so just thank you so much for enlightening me and enlightening our listeners here with us this evening. And a little fun joke, kind of not a joke, but a fun experience, just as like I remember when I was growing up in a small town of Brookings, South Dakota. What we called the coffee shop in town was where the farmers went and had coffee at like 4 or 4:30 in the morning. And we didn't have a Starbucks or anything like this. So for the longest time, like probably until I was 18, I always thought the coffee shop was where farmers met to have coffee. Now that's not the case anymore. But I love the concept of I love the concept of just sitting down with a cup of coffee. That made me envision. It's actually a place called Cook's Kitchen in Brookings, South Dakota. That's where the farmers met when I was growing up, or at the Hy-Vee. So
I love those places.
Yeah, they're wonderful, right?
Yeah,
just wonderful. So we're gonna have a little taste of something that. Little father's cooking corner here. So Troy, get your kitchen aprons out for your kids. We're going to be inspired tonight by Rodger's work in the almond industry. And we're going to whip up some almond flour chocolate chip cookies.
All right.
So what you're going to need to we don't bake. I don't bake very often, just FYI. So, but we're gonna hammer these out. So, kind of the key ingredients or equipment that you're gonna need some kind of. You could use a spoon, but I'm gonna tell you that's gonna be a lot of muscle. So I have a little hand mixer. You're gonna need your measuring cups and spoons. One of the things that I do know about baking is that it is a lot more scientific than it is about just sort of going with the flow. I remember my first time baking something, I think I threw Fruit Loops, Cinnamon Toast Crunch. I just like, oh, this is going to be amazing. And it turned out terrible. So it was like a suicide baking dish. But anyway, so when it comes to baking, measurements and following recipes is always a really, really wise thing to do. And then we will obviously link up the recipe for these almond flour chocolate chip cookies. And so we're going to be dealing with only 8 ingredients. We have the almond flour, we have baking soda, salt, vanilla, chocolate chip cookies, eggs, honey, and coconut oil. So first thing you're going to do when you're going to bake something you want to pop on the kitchen, pop on the oven. So I have the oven humming along at 375. Then you're going to want to measure out all of your ingredients. So what I'm going to do here is, let's see if everybody can see me here. I've gone ahead and I've mixed up my dry ingredients, right? So I put the almond flour, the salt, and the baking soda. And then I'm going to give it just a little bit of a stir to kind of like break up some of the clunks that come when you like when you get almond flour in a bag. It kind of, you get some big clumps and stuff. So I want to kind of sift it. You could use a sifter, but it's too time consuming for me, so I'm just going to do it this way. So I'm going to mix all those dry ingredients together. I'm going to go ahead and add my chocolate chip cookies while I'm or my chocolate chips. And so once all those dry ingredients are combined, I'm going to move then to the wet ingredients. So the eggs, so 3 eggs. Troy, I can already see this happening with your kids, right? Just a mess already.
Absolutely. Hey, I was going to ask you a question too. We cook with almond flour, and I made the huge mistake one time of making the same measurement of almond flour that I would normally do for regular flour, and I learned that the fineness of almond flour, you don't want to do that that much.
No. So I have the eggs in the bottom of a bigger bowl because I'm eventually gonna mix up the wet ingredients, then fold in the dry ingredients. So that's why I'm moving to the bigger bowl. I've got a 1/2 cup of melted coconut oil. Excuse me. I'm gonna add about a 1/2 cup of honey. I'll take a spoon to kind of help that out. All right. Honey's a mess, but it's fun to lick.
Yeah.
All right. And then the last thing I'm going to add is my vanilla to this. So 1 teaspoon of vanilla. And then I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to mix up the wet ingredients here. And you could use like a power mixer too, like one of those KitchenAids. It doesn't matter. You could use a wooden spoon. I just want to get a good mix going in here. And then when I'm ready, I'm going to take those dry ingredients and just sort of slowly combine. The dry, missed some. We'll get that in just a second. Okay, so we have our cookie batter right here. So next thing I'm going to do is once that cookie batter is up, I'm going to find my cookie sheets and I'm going to line them with some parchment paper. I like baking on parchment paper because it really helps bring the cookies up off the sheet rather than sort of, if there's no parchment paper, I feel like it really sticks to the pan and I just don't want to mess up the integrity of my cookies. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to take about a tablespoon. I'm going to eyeball it. And I'm just going to create some dollops along the way. I might do like 6 across or 3 across. You could also use a like an ice cream scoop or something here too. But yeah, so you're gonna load up all those cookies. So I do about 6 aside, and then what I'm gonna do is go ahead and pop that in the oven. And I'm gonna bake those for about 12 minutes. And right at about the 12-minute mark, I'm gonna open up the fridge door. Or not the fridge door, that would be the wrong one. The oven door, and I'm going to pat them down if they seem to be rising up. And then they take approximately about anywhere between 14 to 16 minutes to bake. And let's just get this last cookie going. And I will show you the finished product in just a minute. So I'm going to just finish this. Get every last chocolate chip that you can see. All right. So these go in. All right. So one little quick thing about before I share you the finished product is that, yes, these are like technically gluten-free. I guess someone might even call them paleo because there's no like refined sugar. And I know that when you I even know that when you process almonds down to almond flour, they don't quite hold as much nutritional value as say like the whole almond. So yes, they're technically paleo. Yes, they're technically gluten-free. And there's only 8 ingredients. That doesn't necessarily mean that like it is quote unquote healthy. Now, is it healthier than a cookie with, 13,000 ingredients in it that you can't even pronounce? Maybe. But again, I guess the point here is that it's just like I use these as treats, right? I think that I just really like the taste of these. They're fun to do. It's like do something fun with the kids. So yeah, it's not necessarily like I wouldn't like live off of almond flour chocolate chip cookies and say that I live a healthy life is all I'm trying to say. So there's your disclaimer. But yes, I just dropped one on the floor. But so when they are done, they'll come out and they'll look really nice and soft. And Troy, I'm going to try to send a couple of these to you.
Awesome.
But yeah, so there you go. You've got your almond flour chocolate chip cookies. And they'll come out a little bit softer than your normal cookies, and that's okay. But they're super moist. And they're really, really delicious. And I think I could probably eat all of these in one sitting. But I'm going to send some to Troy. So,
have you got milk in the refrigerator?
Yes, I do.
Well, then they look really good. I can't.
They look
Cookies look delicious, but I always have to chase them down with a little milk.
Well, thank you so much, Rodger. Thank you so much, everyone, for the opportunity to whip up the almond flour chocolate chip cookies. And one interesting thing I learned about baking soda and baking powder today, just to kind of close this off, because I forgot to buy baking soda for my ingredients, but then I was reading that baking soda is 3 to 4 more times potent than baking powder. And then you cannot actually, so the recipe calls for 1 teaspoon of baking soda. You cannot then replace baking powder with 3 tablespoons of baking powder because it doesn't quite still have the same potency. So I learned something new about the baking world today. I was really impressed with myself. So
awesome. Well, I'm going to let Kellen listen to the little segment around cookies not being healthy, because he would probably argue that one to the death in the kitchen, which is, Dad, these are almond cookies. How could they be bad for me? He's got that personality. So
there's a lot to
thank you so much
about those.
Absolutely.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you, Chef Nick. Thank you again, Rodger, for joining us tonight on episode 18. If you're just joining us for the first time, this is the Wyld Farm Family Fun Show. We talk everything about farm, family, food, and most importantly, fun. We're excited to introduce our next few guests. And if you're watching this on YouTube and you're a podcast listener, you can also catch us on any podcast streaming network. So we hope you have a great night, and we will see you next episode.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rodger. Thank you,
Thanks.
Troy.